Ready? All right, my good and beautiful people. Today we are talking about photosynthesis. And photosynthesis, you guys, is how plants produce energy. So plants take in the sunlight basically, and it produces energy of some sort, which is called glucose, right? And they do that through sunlight, yeah? And this right here is what is the equation or the chemical equation that happens. On the left side, we have what goes in to the chemical equation. On the right side, we have what goes out, right? We know that plants, or almost everybody knows that plants produce oxygen, right? The oxygen we breathe, that's why it's so important to have plants around so that we can keep breathing, right? So that we can continue to have life. And they take the CO2, which is something that we exhale, right? You exhale carbon dioxide and you inhale oxygen. So for the plants, it's opposite. That it starts with carbon dioxide, you add in sunlight, carbon dioxide and water and sunlight, and you end up with also 6 molecules of oxygen. Cool? Yeah? So very simply put, it is how plants breathe, right? That's how they create energy. Okay, so why is it important? Well, organic molecules like glucose, right? Glucose are sugars, right? Out of inorganic materials. So it makes organic molecules like glucose out of inorganic material like carbon dioxide and water. So it takes 2 things and it mixes them and it produces sugars or energy, right? It begins all food chain webs, thus all life is supported by this process. So without photosynthesis, we don't live because we need that to be able to survive, okay? All right, and lastly, it also makes oxygen gas, and obviously we need that to breathe. So it is also the start of every ecological or ecological food web. How do we know? Well, the sun is the source of energy in most living things, right? We need the sun to survive, if not directly, indirectly, and it hits plants such as grass, which uses energy from the sun to make their own food, the plants we eat, and so forth. And for example, the zebra comes in and he eats that grass, and the lion comes and eats that zebra. So essentially, it all began with photosynthesis, and it began with light hitting that plant. Yeah? Questions? Okay. So what does photosynthesis mean? Well, it actually is a Greek word, and it comes, photo means light, and synthesis, there's a different word for it, but the original actually means putting together. So essentially, it's putting together with light, right? So plants use sunlight to turn water and carbon dioxide into glucose, and glucose is a kind of sugar. So you take in sunlight, like we have on our equation, right? You take in the carbon dioxide, you take in the water, and then you add sunlight to it, and thus you have the other reaction, right? And plants use glucose as food for energy and as a building blocks for growing. Autotrophs, there are 2 types of photosynthesis, or 2 types of, what are they called? Almost like not organisms, but there are the autotrophs that make their own food, that make their own glucose, and heterotrophs that are consumers of it. So for example, autotrophs are like plants. Plants make their own food. You don't have to give them food to eat, right? So they take water and they take sunlight and oxygen, carbon dioxide, and it produces its own food and it grows naturally. So all you have to do with plants is give them water, right? Whereas for us, we don't produce our own sugars, we don't produce our own energy, we have to consume it by eating the plants, by eating the animals, right? So that is what a heterotroph is, okay? Hetero meaning many, auto means automatic, right? That's one way to remember them. Autotrophs, automatic. Heterotrophs, many, okay? They need different sources. Okay, so how do we know that plants make carbohydrates, carbohydrates, which is like the fatty and I can't even think. Okay, the carbs basically that provide the energy, like glucose, for example, is a carbohydrate. We think that, you know, like when we think of food or when we think of glucose, we automatically think it's bad. We automatically think processed sugar, but that's not what it is. When we think of carbohydrates, we also automatically think of like bread and potatoes and things like that, but that's not just what carbohydrates have, okay? Carbohydrates, they provide the energy. So if they, what they do is, so how do we know that they form carbohydrates from just carbon dioxide, water, and energy lights? Well, we know that through experiments, okay? So we have a few experiments that happen, but particularly John Battista Helmont, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but anyways, in 1648, he planted a willow branch, and that willow branch weighed 5 pounds and into 200 pounds of soil. Then after 4 years, the tree weighed 169 pounds and the soil was still nearly 200 pounds, okay? So what we're trying to say is that he did this experiment where he measured the amount of soil, right? He measured the weight of the soil. If plants need dirt to kind of consume it, then the amount of soil would have decreased, right? But it didn't. It stayed at approximately 200 pounds, but the weight of the tree or the branch went from 5 pounds to 169 pounds after 4 years. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's why we know that plants are autotrophs. They can produce their own carbohydrates, and glucose is a type of carbohydrates. So plant leaves have many types of cells, okay? And these are some of the ones that they have, okay? Cool. So what do we care? Why do we care about plant leaves? Well, plant leaves are important. This is how they kind of grow. And leaves are green because they can contain the pigment called chlorophyll, right? We talked about it last time as well, or if you're watching, we talked about it in another video. So they have chlorophylls, and that's why in a lot of like cell pictures, you look at them and you see green stuff, or they depict it as green because they have that pigment. Sorry. All right, so leaves have a large surface area to absorb as much light as possible. That's why leaves look the way they do right now, because it needs to absorb all that light. Because light, again, produces energy and it produces life. Without the plant consuming that light or being exposed to light, then it cannot produce energy. Yeah? So what happens in photosynthesis? Well, absorbing light energy to make chemical energy into glucose. So we start with light, and light has energy in it. And then we turn that into chemical energy, or the plants, not we, but the plants turn that into chemical energy called glucose. And the pigments, what they do is they absorb different colors of white light, all right? The main pigment is the chlorophyll, which is not necessarily going to be on your test, but nevertheless. And so that is why they are green. Any questions so far? Anything confusing? Okay.
So is the autotrophs and the heterotrophs, is it better than test?
Probably, but it's just good to know them. So autotrophs are just basically plants, and heterotrophs are basically everything else. Okay, that's what you need to know. That plants produce their own food. People, animals don't produce their own food. That's it. which is something you already know, but it's just a name. Okay? And we don't care why we see green. All right, so photosynthesis happens in two phases, right? We have the light-dependent reaction, and that means it depends on light, right? So you have to have sunlight for it to happen. So light dependent, it's in the name, and light independent reactions, which means that that part does not need light. Okay? Yeah? Everybody good so far? All right. So light dependent converts light energy into chemical energy. Okay, so both of them have energy. It's not something new, but you're taking that energy and converting it into something else. Excuse me. That produces ATP molecules to be used to fuel light independent reaction. Okay, so what happens is we have the light dependent reaction, which takes in the light and transforms that light into chemical energy, which is also ATP. You can think about ATP as like a currency, right? Energy currency in the cell. Which is kind of like an equivalence to the dollar, right? So if you wanted to go buy, if you want to go buy something in the US, you can't use pesos, you have to use dollars, right? So that's what ATP does. It's almost like the money of the cell, right? So then the ATP is taken and that's the energy that is used for the light independent reaction, okay? So the first one needs light, the second one needs ATP. But that second one doesn't happen without the first one because that's where you get the ATP from. Yeah? Yes, no, maybe. This would be the time to ask. Okay? All right. So light independent uses ATP to produce, to make simple sugars. Again, simple sugar does not mean the one you put in your coffee, right? These are just things that produce energy, okay? Yeah? All right. So light-dependent reactions, they require, obviously, light. First and foremost, they require light, and they happen in the chloroplast inside the thylakoids. There you go. And the chloroplasts, or the thylakoids, they trap the energy from the light. It's like they're in prison, right? They trap that energy. And light excites electron, okay? So it makes the electron, you guys are familiar with chemical a molecule or a chemical, right? So that chemical has a positive and then negative and then neutral, right? So the proton, the neutron, and the electron. Well, it can have multiple electrons, right? So what happens is that it excites the electron. And when that happens, that electron is kicked out of the chlorophyll into an electron transport chain. So there's like a special enzyme that it goes into, and that enzyme takes it and it travels somewhere else, right? And the electron transport chain is a series of proteins in the thylakoid membrane, okay? So they're kind of like these balls that they grab whatever and they carry it somewhere else. Yeah? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. All right. So light-dependent reactions energy lost. So in the light-dependent reaction, or light reactions, as they call it, energy lost along electron transport chain. That's what happens. So you have energy that from the electron that gets carried, there is energy that's being lost, and lost energy is used to recharge the ATP from ADP. ATP is has triphosphate. Okay, so it has 3 phosphates, and ADP has 2. So then when one of the phosphates is lost, it needs to be recharged and added, and that makes ATP. okay? All right. Then we have the NADHP, which produced from the electron transport chain. And what that does is that it stores energy until transferred to the stroma. All right, and that plays an important role in light-dependent reaction. Once the light-dependent reaction is done, ATP is produced, NADP is produced, and oxygen is produced. Cool. All right, so how did we get CO2 two oxygens as a byproduct? Well, photosynthesis replaces lost electron by splitting water in two, okay? So what's water? H2O, right? H2O. H stands for hydrogen, right? So what happens is that we have sunlight, we have water, and then it fuels the next run, which is what is produced is NADPH and ATP and water, and oxygen, and then the oxygen is kind of kicked out and we breathe it. Okay? So they take the two hydrogens and form something else. Cool? All right, so let's, at each step along the transport chain, the electrons loses energy. All right, so what do we have? We have light energy is transferred from the chlorophyll from the sun, and then the chlorophyll passes energy down through the electron transport chain, and throughout electrons are being lost. And then energized electron provides energy that splits into CO2, right? And and hydrogen, sorry, not splits into CO2, splits H2O. So one hydrogen goes to the NADP, so it becomes NADPH, right? You can see it here in the cycle. And then we have, for the use of light independent reaction, we carry that other hydrogen, and then oxygen is kind of expelled, and that hydrogen helps forming the ATP, transferring it to ADP. And yeah, so it becomes a hydrogen bond that is added to the ADP, I believe. I may be wrong on that one. Don't quote me on that one. Okay, but that's basically it, right? So we have the light dependent cycle and the light independent cycle. Yeah? And then it becomes that cycle again. It's like a cyclical motion, right? So light independent reaction does not require light, and it's called the Calvin cycle, and it occurs in the stroma of the chloroplast. So it's inside the chloroplast, kind of like the white places that you normally see, and it requires CO2, and it uses ATP and NADPH as a fuel to run, and it makes glucose, sugar from CO2 and hydrogen. Okay, so it combines CO2 and hydrogen and it produces glucose. So let's take a look at it. So CO2 comes in, we have ATP, and it loses a phosphate, so it becomes ADP, and then that, then the NADPH loses one and it becomes, well, you can do the other cycle, the other side as well. And then it becomes positive, and then you have glucose, and then the same cycle goes back and forth, right? So you can see the ATP losing an ADP, then you have the CO2 coming in, and then it loses, so we change the ATP into ADP and so forth, right? So it's very cyclical. It starts here, ends here. You guys can't see what I'm pointing at. It starts here, ends here. Cool? Questions? Okay. So what affects photosynthesis? Well, light density. So as light increases, rate of photosynthesis increase, right? So if you are hiding the plant under the table, it probably isn't going to grow so much. But if you leave the plant outside as it's supposed to be, like each plant is different, but in the light that it needs, then more photosynthesis will happen. Okay. Carbon dioxide, so as CO2 rates increase, rates of photosynthesis increase, right? Because they take in CO2 and sunlight and water, right? Okay, temperature is low, means that there's low photosynthesis because light has energy, right? And it's, yeah. And increased temperature, rate of photosynthesis increased. If the temperature is too hot, then the rate drops. Today we are in the high desert. You can look outside and you can see that it's not very green, right? Whereas if you go to other parts of the state, you'll find that there are a lot of trees, right? And that's because over here in the desert is hot. So plants don't necessarily grow at that rate. So there isn't a lot of photosynthesis. Too cold is bad, right? So like Alaska, not many plants out there. Desert, not many plants out here. Yeah? Alaska in the winter. Alaska in the summer has a lot of plants, for the record. All right. So let's see if we got it. The process that uses sun's energy to make simple sugar is called photosynthesis. All right. And then the function accomplished by the light independent reaction is called, we didn't talk about this. Light dependent reaction. I think it's called carbon fixation. But I'm not sure. We didn't talk about it. I don't know why it's there. Anyways, that is basically it. So we start from the light, we convert a bunch of things, and then we do the Calvin cycle. And that Calvin cycle is the light independent, and what happens in the chloroplast, that is the light dependent. Cool, my people? Awesome. So that's it for this video. And let's see.